The knock came twice. Nathaniel set down his teacup before the third one could land. The brass clock on the mantel said it was barely past 8, and no one knocked at 8 unless something had already happened that could not be undone. He crossed the parlor in 4 strides, polished Oxfords quiet on the wood, and slid the bolt back. The door opened on 3 orcs on his step and a sky the color of cold slate behind them. The eldest stood in front, black velvet, high lace collar, a string of jet beads doubled at her throat. Her hair fell past her waist, straight and very black, with the front strands tucked behind her ears as if she had done it without thinking and then forgotten about it. She did not greet him. She did not wait for him to greet her. "We don't have much," she said plainly, in a voice that had been holding itself together for a number of days he could already begin to count. "Please don't make me explain anything else." Behind her, a younger girl held her sister's hand and would not look up. A black knit dress, gray wool shawl, a small silver cross on a chain. Behind both of them, half a step further back, a boy in a dress shirt that was visibly too big at the shoulders. A father's shirt. Nathaniel registered it the way he registered most things, without comment, without expression. He stepped aside and let the door swing wider. "Come in," he said. "Tea first." The eldest hesitated only long enough for the wind to push a single brown leaf across the threshold. Then she stepped in, and her siblings followed her like 2 shadows tied to her sleeve. Nathaniel shut the door behind them, and the street noise cut off cleanly. The parlor smelled of beeswax and the faintest trace of lilies, which was as close to neutral as he had ever managed in 7 years of trying. He gestured them toward the long settee under the window. "Anywhere you like. The cushions on the right are softer." He went to the side table and put the kettle back on the small iron stove in the corner. He kept 4 cups because 4 was a number that worked for most families that came here, and today the 4th was for him. He measured the leaves by feel. The eldest sat with her back perfectly straight, both hands flat on her knees, beads still. The middle one curled into her sister's side and pressed her face against the shawl. The boy did not sit. He stood by the wall with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floorboards, and the oversized cuff of his father's shirt hung past his knuckles every time he shifted his weight. Nathaniel poured 3 cups and set them on the low table without saying which was for whom. He took his own back to the chair across from them and waited. He had learned, somewhere in the first year, that the second worst thing you could do to people on this kind of morning was talk. The worst was hurry them. The middle girl reached for her cup with both hands and held it close to her mouth without drinking, breathing the steam. The eldest did not touch hers. The boy did not move from the wall. He let the silence sit. Outside, a tram went past on the far street, its bell distant and brief. The clock ticked. The middle girl took the smallest sip he had ever seen anyone take of anything, swallowed, and her shoulders loosened by what could not have been more than 1/4 of an inch. He noticed it. He did not look at her when he noticed it. The boy at the wall said nothing, but his jaw worked once, hard, and he shoved the hair out of his eyes with the back of his wrist. Nathaniel waited until the middle girl had taken a second sip. Then he set his own cup down on the saucer with a small, careful click, and folded his long hands together over his knee. He did not pick up the leather book on the table. He did not open the drawer where the forms were. There was time for forms. There was always, eventually, time for forms. "One question, for now," he said in the same level voice he had used at the door. "What was your father's name?" The eldest's mouth opened, and for a brief moment nothing came out. Her thumb pressed once against the silver locket at her throat, snapped it closed without looking, then opened it again. "Vecca," she said. Nathaniel reached across, slid a small ivory card from the holder beside the lamp, and uncapped his pen. He wrote the name out in full, in the careful, even hand he had inherited from no one, and taught himself in the back office at 22. 5 letters. He set the pen down parallel to the card, looked up. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep that with me." The middle girl's eyes filled and did not spill. The eldest's did not even fill. The boy by the wall finally lifted his head and looked at Nathaniel directly for the first time since the door had opened, and his amber eyes were not soft and not grateful. They were measuring him for something. Nathaniel met the look the way he met every look in this room, without flinching, without performing, without offering anything that had not been asked for. Then the boy spoke, low, almost to the floor. "How much?" Nathaniel did not answer at once. He looked at the boy a moment longer, taking in the tight knot of the black tie, the scuffed school shoes, the wristwatch that had to be tightened on a child's wrist because it had been bought for a man's. Then he capped the pen, set it parallel to the card with Vecca's name, and stood up from the chair with the same unhurried economy he used for everything in this room. "Before that," he said quietly, "there's somewhere we need to go. Then numbers, not the other way around." The boy's mouth tightened. The eldest sister rose with him, smoothing the front of her velvet dress with one flat palm, and the middle one stood last, still clutching the half-full teacup as if she had forgotten she was holding it. Nathaniel nodded toward the small side table by the door. "You can leave the cups. They'll be there when you come back." The middle girl set hers down with both hands, very carefully, the way someone sets down a thing they are afraid to break further. He led them through the parlor, past the heavy drape that separated the front rooms from the working side of the building, down a short corridor lit by a single brass sconce. The floorboards here were older, darker, and creaked in 2 places he had stopped trying to fix because the creaks gave people warning. The eldest walked half a step behind him, beads soundless against the velvet. Her siblings followed in single file, the boy last, hands deep in his pockets. The corridor smelled faintly of cedar and the cold that lived in old brick. Nathaniel stopped at a closed door, painted dark green, brass handle polished, a small card slotted into a brass holder at eye level. He did not open it. He turned and put his back lightly to the wood so that he stood between them and the room itself. The eldest's breath caught once and then steadied. Her gray eyes were fixed on the handle, not on him. The middle girl's free hand had found her sister's sleeve and locked around it. The boy stared at the floorboards again, shoulders pulled up under the loose dress shirt. "Your father is in this room," Nathaniel said. He kept his voice at the same level it had been by the kettle. "He has been cared for. He is covered. He looks the way he looked when he was asleep, as nearly as I could manage." He paused, long enough for the words to land. "Before anyone opens this door, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer for yourself, not for each other." The eldest's chin lifted, very slightly, defensive. He registered it and went on without acknowledging it. "By the law of this town, somebody has to identify him formally. That somebody can be you, if you wish. It can also be me. I have his papers and the description from the medical examiner. I can sign the form, and you do not have to see him today. You can see him tomorrow or the day after when the room is ready for a viewing and not for paperwork. Neither choice is the wrong one." He looked at the eldest sister directly. Raya. He used her name for the first time and saw her register it, the small, reflexive blink. The neighbor had told him at the door. He had remembered it. "If you would prefer I spare you this part, I will. No one in any office will know the difference. It would be on my hand, not yours." He did not soften his face into kindness. He kept it as it had been all morning, which was something close to absent. He had learned that pity was a thing people felt through your skin, and it made things worse, not better. Raya did not answer at once. Her thumb went to the locket again. Open, closed, open. The corridor was so quiet he could hear the brass watch on the boy's wrist ticking. The middle girl pressed her forehead briefly against her sister's shoulder, and a single tear slid down the velvet without sound. Outside, somewhere 2 stories above them, the wind moved against a loose pane, and the building made one of its small, old noises. "I'll do it," Raya said. Her voice was almost steady. Almost. "He's our father. It has to be one of us." Nathaniel inclined his head once. He did not say it was brave. He did not say anything. He turned to reach for the handle. A movement behind her. The boy stepped forward, out of the line, his shoulder brushing his sister's as he passed. "Me too." He set it to the back of Raya's head. His voice cracked in the middle of it, and he did not let it stop him. "Me too. I'm not letting her do it on her own." Raya turned. For the first time since she had stood on his doorstep, her composure showed a crack, narrow and almost invisible, the corners of her mouth pulling down once before she set them again. She looked at her brother. He looked back. His jaw was tight, his hair in his eyes, his father's wristwatch sliding down past the cuff of the too-big shirt and stopping at the bone. He was a head taller than her now, and somehow still smaller. She did not argue. She reached out and touched the back of his hand, once, very briefly, with 2 fingers. "All right," she said. Just that. Nathaniel waited. The middle girl, Ursa, had not stepped forward, and he was glad of it without showing it. She was holding herself up by holding her sister's sleeve, and that was as much as anyone could ask of her this morning. He inclined his head toward the small bench along the corridor wall, the one he had put there for exactly this reason 4 years ago, after a woman had fainted in this hallway and he had not been able to catch her in time. "Ursa?" he said, and she looked up startled at her name. "There is a bench right there. You can sit, you can stand, you can come in. There is no right answer. Whichever, I'll be a step away." Ursa's lip trembled. She nodded once, very small, and sat down on the bench, both hands pressed flat between her knees, the wool shawl bunching at her shoulders. The pearl in her hair clip caught the sconce light and threw a faint, round spot onto the dark wood beside her. Nathaniel turned back to the door. He laid his hand on the brass handle, but did not turn it yet. He looked once at Raya, once at the boy, "Mika," he had heard her say it in the parlor, half under her breath, and waited until both of them had given him the smallest possible nod. Then his fingers tightened on the metal, the cold of it familiar against his palm, and the latch clicked. He did not push the door open. He held it there, against the catch, and looked over his shoulder at the 2 of them one last time. "On 3 breaths," he said very quietly. "Yours, not mine." The boy's hand closed, white-knuckled, around his own wrist. 3 breaths passed. Nathaniel counted them in the small sounds the corridor made. The boy's first one short and snagged, the second longer, the third almost level. He felt the catch give under his thumb, and the green door swung inward on its oiled hinges without a sound. He had oiled it himself 6 years ago, and again last spring. He stepped through first and to the left, holding the door for them, keeping his body angled so that they entered the room and not him. The viewing room was small and lit by 2 standing lamps with cream silk shades, never the overhead. He had learned that early. Overhead light made the dead look dead. Side light made them look like a person you had walked in on while they were resting. The walls were a soft gray-green, papered, with a single framed print of an autumn lane on the far wall. A low table beside the casket held a small cut-glass vase with 3 white roses, fresh that morning. He had paid for the roses himself out of the float in his desk drawer, and would not enter it in the book. Vecca lay in the center of the room on the cloth-covered trestle, in a plain pine coffin lined with unbleached linen. Nathaniel had folded the linen back to the chest. The orc's broad green hands were crossed at the waist, one over the other, the heavier left over the right, the way Nathaniel had learned was customary among the families of the river quarter. He had bathed him himself. He had combed the long black hair back from the forehead and braided it at the nape, simple, the way a working man wears it. The 2 tusks rested clean and even against the lower lip. The face was settled, not stretched, not painted past what was decent. It was the work of 3 quiet hours yesterday evening, and Nathaniel had thrown out his back doing it alone, and he was not going to mention either thing. Raya stopped in the middle of the room. She did not make a sound. Her hand went up to her own throat, to the silver locket, and stayed there. Her eyes moved over her father's face the way a person reads a page they cannot afford to misread, slowly, top to bottom, then back to the top. She took 2 more steps and stopped again, one hand still at her throat, the other dropping to grip the edge of the trestle cloth. The black velvet of her dress made no sound when she moved. The lace handkerchief stayed in her sleeve. Her dark gray eyes were dry. Mika came in 3 steps behind her and stopped at the foot of the coffin. He did not look at his father straight on. He looked at the hands first, the crossed hands, the heavy fingers that were thicker than his own and would never be again, and his throat worked once, then again. The too big cuff of his shirt slid down past his knuckles, and he made no move to push it back. His eyes moved up the chest. He did not let them get to the face. He took 1 step backward instead of forward. Ursa appeared at the doorway. Nathaniel had not heard her get up from the bench. She did not come fully in. She gripped the frame of the door with both hands, looked once at her father, and the tears came without sound, the way they had been coming all morning, running down her round cheeks, soaking the wool of her shawl at the shoulder. She did not sob. She did not move. She simply stood in the doorway and let the water run. Nathaniel stayed at his post by the wall, 2 steps back from the family, hands folded at his waist. He kept his eyes on a point on the far wall, neither on the body nor on the faces. They did not need a witness. They needed a room that held them, and a man who knew how to be furniture. Time bent itself the way it did in here. The standing lamps hummed faintly. Outside, autumn rain had begun, light against the high window. Raya's hand finally left her throat and lowered, slow, to her father's crossed hands. She did not take them. She rested her palm on the back of the heavier left one, very lightly, the way you rest a hand on a sleeping animal you do not want to wake. Her shoulders did not shake. She breathed in through her nose, held it, breathed out, said nothing, took her hand back. Mika turned and walked out. He did not run, he walked. He passed Nathaniel without looking at him, passed his middle sister at the doorframe without touching her, and his footfalls in the corridor were even for the first 4 steps. Then they were not. Nathaniel heard the small, involuntary sound, sharp and bitten back, and the boy's footsteps broke into something half a run. Then the wet sound of someone being sick against the wainscoting of the corridor wall. Raya half turned at the sound. Nathaniel was already moving. "Stay with her," he said to Raya, very low, on the way past. He nodded once at Ursa in the doorframe. "I have him." He did not break stride. He stepped into the corridor, closed the green door behind him with the same care he had opened it, and walked the 8 paces down the hall to where the boy was on his hands and knees beside the bench, his forehead nearly touching the floorboards, one of his father's 2 long cuffs already stained at the wrist. The boy was shaking. His tusks were clenched, and the breath was coming through his nose in short, hard bursts. Nathaniel did not crouch. He went past Mika into the small staff washroom under the stairs, took down a clean glass from the shelf, filled it from the tap, and brought it back. He set it on the floor beside the boy's hand. Then he took the folded gray cloth from the rail of the bench — he kept a clean one there, always, for exactly this — and laid it next to the glass. He did not say anything. He sat down on the floorboards, his back against the corridor wall, the long line of his charcoal-suited legs stretched out in front of him, one ankle crossed over the other. He did not look at the boy. He looked at the picture frame on the opposite wall. A small print of a riverbank in winter. 6 years old now, slightly faded. Mika took the cloth first, wiped his mouth, then the floor, then his own wrist, where the cuff of his father's shirt had taken some of it. He pushed the dirty cloth into a small folded square and held it tight in his fist. He did not pick up the water. Not yet. Minutes passed. Nathaniel counted them in the rain against the high window at the end of the corridor. 2, 5, 8. The boy's breathing slowed in stages, like a stove coming down off the boil. After a while, Mika reached for the glass with a hand that no longer shook quite as hard, and drank a third of it, and set it back down on the floor between them. His eyes stayed on the boards. Nathaniel said nothing. He stayed where he was. When the 10-minute mark went by on the clock above the parlor door, the boy finally drew his knees up to his chest, wrapped both arms around them, and rested his forehead on top. The watch on his wrist, his father's watch, slid down to the bone and stopped there, ticking. He has been carrying something none of us can lift. You and I both know it. Tell me, when you were that age, was there a moment you remember when the world asked too much of you too soon? Stay with these 3 a little longer. If their morning is sitting with you, leave a like and subscribe. The next part is already waiting. Then, from the small corridor that smelled of cedar and rain, the boy spoke without lifting his head. 2 words, muffled through the sleeve. "Don't go." Nathaniel did not go. He stayed on the floor of the corridor until the boy's shoulders had come down from his ears, until the breathing was even again, until Mika finally lifted his head from his knees and pushed the hair out of his eyes with the heel of his hand. Then Nathaniel stood up, slowly, the way a man stands up when his back has been complaining for 2 days, and offered the boy nothing. No hand, no word, no look of pity. He simply walked back down the corridor and opened the green door for the sisters, and the 2 of them came out, and the 4 of them returned to the parlor in the order they had come. Mika took the back of the column. He drank the rest of the water on the way. In the parlor, the tea had gone cold in the abandoned cups. Nathaniel did not refill them. He set the small ivory card with Vecca's name on the low table between himself and Raya, took the leather book down from the side shelf, and laid it open in front of him. He took out his pen, uncapped it, capped it again, and waited until Raya had taken her seat. Yrsa folded herself back into the corner of the settee and pulled the wool shawl up almost over her mouth. Mika stayed at the wall, but closer now, only an arm's length from the back of his sister's chair. Raya sat with her spine straight, both hands flat on her knees, the way she had sat earlier. The lace handkerchief was no longer in her sleeve. It was in her fist. Nathaniel did not comment on it. He turned the leather book so the page faced her, slid the pen across the table, and gave her the small, respectful pause that meant, "You can pick this up when you are ready, not before." When she did pick it up, her fingers were steady. She wrote her father's full name in the box at the top, her own beneath it as next of kin, her address, the address of the apartment building Nathaniel had already seen on the medical examiner's note. Her handwriting was small, sharp, controlled. She passed the book back to him. He set it aside, did not yet write a single figure in it, and laid both his long pianist's hands flat on the leather cover. He said only what needed saying, the simplest service the law required. A plain pine coffin, the one she had already seen, no upgrades. A short ceremony in the small chapel attached to the parlor. A plot in the public cemetery on the eastern hill, third row from the Hawthorne line. A headstone of gray local sandstone, name and dates only. No flowers from him beyond the 3 white roses already on the table beside Vecca. Hearse the morning of, 2 pallbearers from his own staff if needed, no organist, no printed cards. The whole arrangement spoken in a low, even voice, item by item, as if he were reading a recipe she could put down and pick up later. Raya listened without interrupting. Her eyes moved over the surface of the leather book, as if she were reading along. When he had finished, she lifted her chin slightly, the way she had lifted it at the green door. She wanted the figure. She wanted to know the worst of it now, so she would not have to sit through hearing it later. Nathaniel saw the wanting and respected it. He took up the pen. He wrote 1 number on the small ivory card beneath her father's name. He turned the card around and slid it across the table. Raya looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. She did not say anything at first. She picked up the card, held it close, set it down again, and looked at it once more, as if the digits might rearrange themselves. The number was about 1/3 of what she had counted out in her head on the tram this morning. Nathaniel watched her face from across the table without watching her face. He was looking at her hands. The lace handkerchief had come loose in her fist. The fingers had gone the color of milk where she had been gripping it. She asked him, in 1 word, with no softening around it. The word was the obvious word. Why? Nathaniel did not lean forward. He did not soften his voice. He said it the way he had said everything else that morning, level, almost bored, because anything else would have insulted her. That was the actual cost. The rest, he said, was markup. Materials, labor, the use of the room. He did not need the markup today. He left it there. He did not explain further. He did not look apologetic. He picked his pen up, capped it, and set it down beside the card. She did not accept it. Of course she did not accept it. She slid the card back across the table toward him with 1 finger, the way you push a glass of something you cannot afford in a place where you cannot afford to be rude either. Her eyes were dry and very tired. He had seen this exact move a number of times in 7 years. He had seen it from a fisherman's widow last spring, from a tailor's son the autumn before. It was not pride. It was the last fence a person had left, and they were not going to let him climb it for free. Nathaniel did not slide the card back. He did not argue. He turned it over so the figure faced the table, set the pen down on top of it, as if to weigh it, and folded his hands again over the leather book. The card stayed where it was, between them, weighted by the pen. He let the silence settle over it. A clock in the hallway ticked. The rain had stopped against the high window. He met her eyes once, briefly, and gave her the smallest possible movement of his head. Not a nod, not a shake, only an acknowledgment that the card had been seen by both of them and was not going anywhere. Ursa watched from the corner of the settee with the shawl drawn up under her eyes. Mika watched from behind his sister's chair, and his amber eyes had gone narrow in a different way now. Not the measuring look from earlier, something else, something he had not yet named for himself. Nathaniel said only this while standing. He had paperwork to finalize upstairs. The card would stay on the table. They could think on it however long they needed. He would be back down in 20 minutes. If they wanted more tea in the meantime, the kettle was warm. He gathered the leather book under his arm, gave Rhea the same brief inclination of the head he had given her at the green door, and walked toward the stairs. At the foot of them he paused. He did not turn around. He spoke at the banister, quietly enough that only the room could hear it. He told her the number was not charity. He told her it was an invoice, and an invoice did not require her permission to be correct. Then he climbed the stairs. Behind him, on the low table, the ivory card sat under the small weight of the pen. Rhea did not pick it up. She did not slide it back. She sat with both hands flat on her knees and looked at the back of the card for a long time, and her thumb went once to the silver locket at her throat and pressed it shut. Mika, behind her, took one slow step forward and laid his hand on the back of her chair. Yrsa slipped away unnoticed. She did it the way she did most things that morning, without sound, without announcement, the wool shawl trailing from one shoulder as she stood. Her sister and the human were upstairs at the office desk, working over the book a second time, their voices low through the floorboards. Mika had taken himself out to the front step to stand in the cold. Yrsa did not want the front step. She did not want the parlor either, with its cold tea and the ivory card still face down under the pen. She wanted somewhere with no one in it. She found the back corridor by following the smell of cedar and wax until it gave way to something colder. A narrow door at the end of the kitchen passage. The brass handle was old, and her thumb slipped on it once before it caught. The door opened onto 3 stone steps down, and the small walled garden lay beyond them in the gray autumn light. It was nothing much. A square of flagstones, mossed at the edges. 2 low beds of nothing in particular, cut back for the season. A hawthorn tree in the far corner, half bare, its red berries dulled with rain. Under the tree, 1 wooden bench, weathered to the color of driftwood. The walls were dark brick, 8 feet high, with ivy climbing 2 sides. The town beyond the walls made the small sounds it always made, a tram bell, a dog, the river somewhere to the south. None of it touched her. She crossed the flagstones and sat on the bench, and her tights were thin against the cold of the wood, and she did not care. She did not cry. She had cried already, in the doorway of the green room, and there did not seem to be anything left in her for the moment. She held the silver cross at her throat between her thumb and her forefinger and turned it, slowly, the way one turns a coin in a pocket. and looked at the bare branches of the hawthorn above her head. A single brown leaf came down and landed on her shoe. She did not move her foot. The garden door opened behind her after some long time. Nathaniel came down the 3 stone steps in the same unhurried way he came down every set of stairs in this building. He did not call out. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not sit. He stopped 2 paces from the bench with his hands in the pockets of his charcoal waistcoat and looked at the hawthorn the same way she had been looking at it. He had brought his gray wool overcoat draped over one arm. After a moment, he laid it on the end of the bench, folded, within her reach. He did not look at her when he did it. He asked, very quietly, only one thing: whether she wanted company on the bench or whether she wanted the bench to herself. He said either was the right answer. Ursa nodded. She did not say which. He took the nod for the first and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving the folded coat between them like a small gray island. He stretched his long legs out in front of him, crossed one polished Oxford over the other, and did not say anything else. A second leaf came down. This one landed on the back of his hand. He let it stay there. She did not know how long they sat. Long enough that the cold in the wood worked its way through her tights to the back of her knees. Long enough that the dampness in the hem of his trousers darkened the cuff. Somewhere over the eastern wall, the bell of a tram rang twice and went quiet. A blackbird in the ivy made one short call and did not repeat it. She moved the folded coat onto her own lap eventually, almost without deciding to, and laid her hand flat on the wool of it, and the warmth of where he had been carrying it came through the cloth into her palm. She kept her hand there. He did not comment. After a while, she began to speak. She did not look at him. She looked at the hawthorn berries. She told him, very quietly, that her father had used to whistle when he made tea, always the same tune, and badly, and never the whole way through. He forgot the end every time, and would start it again from the beginning. She told him that on Saturdays her father had gone down to the river before any of them were awake, and brought back 2 bread rolls from the bakery at the corner of the bridge, and had warmed them in a clean cloth on the stove, and that the cloth had had a small burn mark on one corner from a morning he had let the bread sit too long. She told him that her father had read aloud to Mika, even when Mika had stopped wanting to be read to, even when Mika had pretended not to be in the room, that he had read on anyway, to the wall if he had to, until Mika had drifted back in without admitting it. She stopped. Her voice had stayed steady the whole way through, which surprised her. Nathaniel did not respond at once. He did not turn his head, did not offer condolences, did not say the things people said. He simply reached, slowly, into the inside pocket of his waistcoat and took out a small card, plain, ivory, the same paper as the one inside on the parlor table, and a short pencil. He laid the card on his thigh and wrote in his exact, even hand, "The whistle, the bread cloth with the burn mark, the reading aloud, even to the wall." He wrote each line on its own. He did not embellish. He did not add anything she had not said. When he had finished, he capped the pencil and slid the card across the bench over the folded coat until it rested under her palm. He did not push it further than that. He said only that it was for the service, only if she wanted. He said it without looking at her, in the same level tone he had used at the front door at 8 in the morning. Ursa picked up the card with both hands, read each line again. She did not cry. She set the card on her knee, smoothed it flat with her thumb as if she could press the words into the paper a second time, and finally lifted her face to look at him directly. He was already not looking. He was looking at the hawthorn berries. The leaf on the back of his hand had blown off some minutes ago, and he had not noticed. She slid her thumb to the dimple it usually made when she smiled, and the dimple, briefly, came back. Then it was gone again. The card she folded once, lengthwise, and tucked into the small pocket sewn into the front of her knit dress, the one her father had stitched on for her himself 2 winters ago because she kept losing tram tickets in the lining. The garden door opened behind them on its hinge. Mika stood at the top of the 3 stone steps. He had heard the last of it, or some of it, or none of it. Ursa could not tell from his face. He was looking past her at Nathaniel with that narrow amber look he had been wearing since the corridor floor. He did not come down the steps. He stood there in his father's too big shirt, with the wind moving the long hair off his forehead, and his hand was tight on the doorframe. You know the way it is when one small kindness goes in under your guard and you cannot get it back out. When you have been holding yourself together for somebody else, and someone hands you a card with 3 lines on it, and the card weighs more than the morning has. If a moment in this story has done that to you, even quietly, leave a like and stay with us. Their hardest day is not over yet, and I would like you in the room for the rest of it. Then Mika spoke from the top of the steps, one sentence, low and rough, addressed to Nathaniel and no one else. He wanted to know what the human wanted from them, really. Nathaniel did not answer at once. He turned his head, slowly, the way a man turns when he is being asked a fair question he has been asked before, in other words. Mika stood at the top of the 3 stone steps, his hand wide on the doorframe, his amber eyes hard. The wind moved the hair off his forehead and showed the small scattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose. Behind Nathaniel, on the bench, Ursa had gone very still, her hand pressed flat to the front of her knit dress, where she had tucked the small ivory card. Nathaniel did not stand up. He looked at the boy from the bench, level, and said, in the same voice he had used in the corridor, that what he wanted was for them to bury their father properly. Nothing further. He said it once, did not repeat it, and did not soften it. Then he turned back to the hawthorn and let the boy do what he would do with that. Mika stood there a long moment. He did not nod, and he did not argue. After a while he stepped back from the doorframe and let the garden door swing closed behind him, and his footsteps went away down the corridor, slow. The knock at the front door of the parlor came perhaps a quarter of an hour later. Nathaniel was already back inside by then. He had walked Ursa in from the garden without comment, had handed her the folded gray overcoat to keep across her knees on the settee, and had gone himself to the side table to set a fresh kettle on the iron stove. Raya was at the desk by the front window, working through a second sheaf of small papers, bank statements, the lease, the medical bill from the apartment block. She did not look up at the knock. She had been ignoring all sounds that were not numbers for the past hour. Nathaniel went to the door himself. He did not wipe his hands on a cloth first, the way he sometimes did. He simply went and opened it. The man on the step was perhaps 60, broad in the shoulders, in a long black coat better cut than Nathaniel's own, a silk scarf at the throat, a black Homburg in one gloved hand. The face was the face of a man who had eaten well for 40 years and slept well for 30 of them. Nathaniel knew the face. The larger funeral house was 4 streets over, the one with the gold lettering on the window and the 2 black motor cars in the side yard. The director smiled, professionally, and asked if he could have a quiet word. Nathaniel stepped out onto his own front step and pulled the door almost closed behind him. He did not invite the man in. The 2 of them stood under the small overhang in the cold, and the wind moved a brown leaf across the boots of one and the polished Oxfords of the other, and the conversation that followed took less than 4 minutes. The director spoke first, and at length. He spoke of professional standards. He spoke of the difficulty of running an establishment in a small town. He spoke of the risk, he said, of setting expectations in a community that could not afford expectations. He spoke of having been in the trade for 31 years and of having seen many young men with kind intentions damage the work for everyone who came after them. He used the word undercut twice, very gently, the way one places a coin on a counter without letting it ring. He suggested, with a small movement of his gloved hand, that Nathaniel reconsider the figure on whatever piece of paper was inside on his desk. Nathaniel let him finish. He let the silence sit after the man had stopped speaking. The wind moved another leaf. From inside, very faintly, the kettle began to whistle, and he listened to it for the second or third note before he answered. He said, level, that he was not undercutting anyone. He said that he was doing his job at cost, today, for this family, for reasons that were his own, and that he did not intend to set out on his own front step. He said that the price on the paper inside was the actual price of the materials and the actual price of the labor, and that the markup was a thing he was choosing not to take on this one funeral, and that was the beginning and the end of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away. He used the same tone he had used to ask for Vecca's name at 8 in the morning. The director's mouth tightened. He said something further, briefer this time, about precedent, and Nathaniel let that one go past him. He said only, in conclusion, that the door he was standing in front of had his own name above it, and that the figures inside were his to write. He inclined his head once, in the same minimal way he had inclined it to Raya at the green door, and waited. The director looked at him a moment longer. Then he put on his Homburg, adjusted the silk scarf at his throat, and said the conversation had been a pleasure. He turned and walked down the 3 stone steps to the pavement, and his cane tapped twice on the flagstones, and he was gone past the corner before Nathaniel let go of the door handle. Nathaniel stood there a moment longer in the cold. He looked down at the brass plate beside his own door, the one with his uncle's name still half visible underneath his own, where the engraver had not quite scoured the older letters away. He breathed out once through his nose. He went back inside. He had not seen Mika in the doorway of the small side corridor. The boy had heard it. All 4 minutes. He had been on his way back to the parlor from the kitchen. He had gone to get a glass of water for his sister, the older one, who had not asked for it, and had stopped behind the half-open inner door when he heard the voices on the step. He had stood there with the glass in his hand the whole time. He had not moved when the kettle whistled. He had not moved when the director's cane went tapping away down the pavement. He had not moved when Nathaniel had come back in and pulled the front door closed behind him with the same small click he used for every door in the building. Mika stayed in the side corridor a long moment after Nathaniel had passed. He looked at the glass of water in his own hand. He looked at the back of the human who was already walking away from him toward the parlor, the dark charcoal of the waistcoat, the loosened black tie at the neck, the long, straight back of a man who had not changed his voice once in the conversation he had just had over his own front step. The narrow look in the boy's amber eyes was gone. Something else had come into his face, slower, that he did not yet have a name for. He stood there with the glass of water cooling in his palm, and did not move to follow. In the parlor, Raya was still bent over the papers at the desk, and she had not heard any of it. Ursa was at the settee with the gray overcoat across her knees. Nathaniel went to the kettle and lifted it off the stove before the whistle climbed any higher, and the small, sharp sound thinned out and stopped, and the building went quiet again. Behind him, in the side corridor, Mika finally took one step, then another. Toward the parlor, with the glass of water held very carefully, level, the way his father had once shown him to carry a full thing across a room without spilling. 1856. Mika came down the next morning early. He came down before his sisters, before the church bells over on the eastern hill, before the milk cart on the corner. He came down in the same too-big shirt of his father's, the same black tie tied tight at the throat, his hair shoved back with water from the basin upstairs. He stopped at the foot of the parlor stairs with both hands in his pockets, and he stood there a long moment before he made himself cross the rug. Nathaniel was already at the desk. He had been up since 5, which was not unusual. He had a small cup of black coffee at his elbow, and the leather book open under the lamp, and he was working through the morning list in the same exact hand he used for everything. He looked up when the floorboards spoke beneath the boy. He did not greet him. He simply set the pen down parallel to the page and waited. Mika kept his eyes on a point somewhere past Nathaniel's left shoulder. He said he wanted to know if there was work around the place. He said he could clean, lift, carry, sweep, polish. He said he wanted to earn toward the figure on the card downstairs. He said it in one short run of words, without inflection, the way a person says a thing they have rehearsed in the dark of an upstairs guest room for an hour and a half before coming down. Nathaniel looked at him a moment. He did not soften his face. He did not stiffen it, either. He capped the pen. He told the boy, level, that he could use help in the parlor for tomorrow's service. The floor needed polishing, the chairs needed wiping down, the brass on the chapel doors needed a turn with the cloth. He said the pay for the funeral was the figure they had already agreed downstairs, and that the figure would not change because of any work the boy did this morning. He said the boy could stay and clean anyway, if what he wanted was to be doing something with his hands while the day went on around him. He let the offer sit. He did not insult it with kindness. Mika's jaw moved once. He had come down to argue, possibly. He did not. He gave the smallest possible nod, 2 inches, almost nothing, and his hand came out of his pocket and pushed the hair back from his forehead. Nathaniel rose from the desk and led him through to the back stairs without further comment, and showed him the cupboard under the stairs where the cloths and the polish and the brushes lived. He took a clean apron of gray canvas off the hook, the one his uncle had used before him, and laid it across the boy's arm without ceremony. He did not say anything when Mika had to fold the apron strings twice over at the back because his waist was narrower than a grown man's. The strings were old, frayed at the ends, soft from years of being tied and untied. Nathaniel left him to it. They began with the floor. Nathaniel showed him the polish, a tin of dark beeswax that had been in this cupboard since before Nathaniel had taken over the building, that had to be warmed slightly between the palms before it would spread. He showed him the grain of the boards, which ran the length of the parlor rather than the width, and which had to be worked with rather than against. He showed him the cloth, a thick wool square folded into quarters, dipped only barely into the tin, then drawn across the wood in a steady pull. Then he handed Mika the tin and the cloth, and went to the other end of the room and started on his own section without saying anything more. They worked in silence. The morning light came through the tall windows in long, pale columns and laid itself across the floor in the way it always did in this room at 6:30 in autumn. The wax warmed under their hands, and the smell of beeswax filled the parlor, sharp and clean, layered over the older smell of the building. Nathaniel did the long center strip and the corners along the window wall. Mika took the inner half, beside the rug, and the 4 corners by the side door. The boy did not hurry. He drew the cloth in long, even pulls the way he had been shown, and where he met the edge of a chair leg or the foot of the settee, he set the tin down and worked the corner carefully with 2 fingers wrapped in the cloth. And he did not skip the bit underneath, because no one was watching. Nathaniel watched anyway, once, from his own end. Did not comment. After an hour, the floor was done. Nathaniel pointed him to the chairs next. 12 of them, the small, pale wood chairs that he set out in the chapel for services, currently stacked in pairs along the wall of the back corridor. He showed Micah the second cloth, the soft one, and the small bottle of clear oil. He did the demonstration on the first chair himself, the seat, the back, the rungs, the legs all the way down to where they met the floor, and handed the cloth to the boy and went away upstairs to fetch his ledger without checking the second chair. When he came back down 40 minutes later, Micah had finished 4. The boy was on the 5th, on his knees on the corridor floor, working oil into the join between the back leg and the seat, with the corner of the cloth pinched between his thumb and his forefinger. His father's wristwatch had slid down again and was resting on the corridor boards beside him, still ticking, because the cuff would not stay up. He had not stopped to push it back up. He had taken the watch off entirely so as not to scratch the chair, and laid it where he could keep an eye on it. Nathaniel saw the watch on the boards. He did not say anything about it. He set the ledger down on the side table, fetched another cloth from the cupboard, and started on the 6th chair from the other end. They worked their way toward each other in silence. They met in the middle on the 9th chair, and Micah stepped back without a word and let Nathaniel finish that one alone while he himself began on the 10th. There was no division of which was whose. There was only the work, and the slow narrowing of the line of unfinished chairs against the wall, and the wax smell in the corridor laid over the cedar. When the last chair was done, Micah stood up, stiff, and rubbed the small of his own back with the heel of his hand, the way a much older man might. He saw Nathaniel notice the gesture. He stopped doing it. He bent down, picked up his father's watch from the boards, slid it onto his wrist, and tightened it himself one more notch with his teeth on the strap, which made it sit closer to his bone than it had any morning before this one. Nathaniel handed him the brass polish next, without comment. The chapel handles, the corridor sconces, the small plate beside the front door with his uncle's name half scoured underneath his own. Micah took the tin. He looked at it for a moment. He turned it over in his hand. He said, finally, very low, the first thing he had said since coming down the stairs, that his father had been a builder, that his father had taught him to do corners properly, that his father had said anyone could do the middle of a thing, but only an honest man did the edges where nobody looked. Nathaniel let the sentence sit in the corridor between them. He did not answer it at first. He capped his own oil bottle, slowly, set it on the side table, and only then said, level and short, that the boy's father sounded like he had been a man worth listening to. Micah's jaw moved. He did not say anything else. He took the brass tin and went off down the corridor toward the chapel doors, and his footsteps were even, and the polished Oxfords of the human went the other way toward the parlor, and the building was very quiet for the next half hour, except for the small sound of cloth on metal at one end of the building, and the small sound of a pen on paper at the other. When Micah came back into the parlor at midday with the empty tin and the dirty cloths folded into a small square in his hand, the brass handles of the chapel doors behind him had been turned to the color of warm honey, all 4 of them, even the lower edge of the bottom hinge where no one ever looked. He set the tin on the side table without ceremony. He did not look at Nathaniel. He untied the apron strings, folded the gray canvas in half and in half again, and laid it across the back of the nearest chair as carefully as if it were a coat. Then he looked at Nathaniel directly, once, briefly, and gave the smallest possible nod he had given so far. 2 inches. Almost nothing. He went upstairs to find his sisters. Raya came down at dusk. She had spent most of the day upstairs in the small guest room Nathaniel had given them, the 3 of them sharing the one room because Ursa would not be alone and Mika would not say he wanted to be near them. She had gone over the lease one more time, written 4 short letters to her father's old employer and to the landlord and to the bank, and had not eaten the bread Nathaniel had left on the tray outside the door at noon. She had slept perhaps an hour after that, the kind of sleep that leaves a person more tired afterwards than before. When she came down, the light through the tall parlor windows had gone the color of weak tea. The parlor was empty. The kettle on the iron stove was cold. The leather book was closed on the desk, the lamp turned down low, and a single sheet of paper lay across the closed cover with her name at the top in Nathaniel's exact hand. He had stepped through to the work side of the building. She heard the small sounds from the back rooms, cloth on metal, slow, regular. She did not go in immediately. She stood in the parlor doorway, at the heavy drape that separated the front of the building from the rooms behind it, and listened a long moment. The sound was the sound of someone polishing something carefully. Not the brass on the chapel doors. Those had been done that morning. She had passed them on the way down. Something heavier, lower in the room. She pulled the drape aside. The small back workroom was lit by 2 standing lamps with the same cream silt shades as the viewing room. The shutters were closed. The trestle in the center was empty now. Her father had been moved into the chapel earlier in the day, where he would wait until morning. In the trestle's place, the plain pine coffin sat on 2 low sawhorses, the lid set neatly to one side against the wall. The unbleached linen was folded back. The brass handles along the side and the brass screws at the corners caught the lamplight in small, steady points. Nathaniel stood at the long side of the coffin, his jacket draped over a chair behind him, his sleeves rolled to mid-forearm. He had taken off his pocket watch and laid it on the chair beside the jacket. In one hand he held a small, soft cloth. In the other, a tin of polish, different from the one Mika had used, finer, the kind used on jewelry. He was working on the brass handles by hand, one at a time, slowly, in a small circular motion that began at the base of the handle and worked out toward the curve. He had been doing it some while. 2 of the 3 handles on this side were already finished. They had the warm, honeyed glow of brass that had been worked properly, not the dull factory finish they had carried that morning. He was on the 3rd. He did not look up when the drape moved. He had not heard her, or he had heard her and was leaving her the choice of whether to come in or to go back. It was the same courtesy he had used at the green door. Raya recognized it without naming it. She stayed in the doorway a long minute. Her father's pine coffin, the brass handles being polished by hand in a back room at dusk by a man who was being paid less than the cost of the materials to do it. She watched him work. He drew the cloth across the curve of the handle in the same steady pull he had used on the parlor floor that morning when he had shown the boy how to lay wax. He did not hurry. He did not stop. He covered the whole of the handle, then took a clean square of a second cloth and buffed it dry. He moved a quarter step along the side of the coffin and began on the 4th. Raya stepped inside. He noticed her, finally, on the 2nd pass of the cloth. He did not startle. He did not stop. He simply registered her presence at the edge of his eye, gave the smallest possible inclination of his head, the same 2 inches he had been giving her since the door at 8 in the morning, and went back to the handle. He did not ask if she needed anything. He did not put the cloth down. He understood, evidently, that she had not come for a conversation, and that to offer one would have been an insult to whatever it was she had actually come for. Raya stood beside the coffin for a moment with her arms folded over the front of her black velvet dress. She watched his hands. The long pianist's fingers, careful, the small silver ring on the right pinky catching the lamplight on every second stroke. She watched the cloth darken slightly at the edge where the polish was lifting the old tarnish out of the brass. She uncrossed her arms. She crossed the workroom to the side table where the cloths were stacked. She took a clean one. She came back to the long side of the coffin, opposite to where he was working, picked up the small second tin of polish that he had set down within reach of either side of the coffin, a thing she only noticed when she was already lifting it, and began on the first handle of her side. She did not ask him to show her. She had been watching for 2 minutes from the doorway. She knew the motion. She held the cloth the way he held his, dipped it the same shallow way into the tin, and started at the base of the handle, working outward in the small circular motion. He did not comment. He did not look across at what she was doing. He kept his eyes on his own work and his own hands, and let her have her side of the box without supervision. They worked. The lamps hummed. The shutters held the dusk out. Somewhere upstairs Ursa moved briefly across a floorboard, then was still again. The small sounds of cloth on brass came from both sides of the coffin in a rhythm that was not quite the same, his slower, hers a half-beat faster at first, then evening out as her shoulders dropped and her breathing slowed to match the work. The smell of the polish was thin and clean, a metallic note over the lamp oil and the cedar. Raya finished her first handle. She moved to the second. The brass came up under her cloth the way it had come up under his, the dull surface lifting slowly into the warm, steady glow. She had not done this kind of work in years. Her hands remembered it from somewhere, perhaps from her own mother's small kitchen, perhaps from helping her father at the workshop one of the years she had still been small enough to be allowed there. She did not chase the memory. She let the cloth move and the brass come up, and that was all. 40 minutes passed. They did not speak. The light beyond the shutters changed from weak tea to the color of the inside of an empty cup. Nathaniel finished his side. He did not start on hers. He stepped back from the coffin, wiped his cloth on a clean square, set the polish down, and crossed quietly to the side table where he refolded the used cloths into a small stack. He did not look at her. He let her finish her last 2 handles in her own time, on her own side, without an audience. When she had done, she stood back. She looked at the box. The brass at all 4 sides caught the lamplight evenly now, the same warm honey color, top to bottom, corner to corner. The pine of the lid against the wall was plain and unvarnished, and exactly the kind of coffin her father would have chosen for himself, if anyone had thought to ask him in time. She turned to face Nathaniel. He was waiting at the side table, hands loose at his sides, the cloth folded. He met her eyes once and did not hold the look longer than was needed. Rhea opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said simply, "Thank you." 2 words, quiet, no softness around them. The first time in 2 days that she had thanked anyone for anything. Nathaniel inclined his head 2 inches. He did not say it was nothing. He did not say she was welcome. He said only, level and short, that her father's box was ready for the morning. He took up his jacket from the chair, slid the pocket watch back into the waistcoat pocket, and turned down the wick on the nearest standing lamp until the room dimmed by half. He waited for her in the doorway, and when she had crossed to him, he held the heavy drape aside for her with one long arm and let her go through to the parlor first. Behind them, in the half-light of the workroom, the 4 brass handles on her father's pine coffin caught the last of the lamp and held it. The bell at the eastern hill rang 9. Nathaniel stood in the small vestibule between the parlor and the chapel and listened to it. He had been up since 4. He had walked the chapel twice before dawn, once with the lamp and once without it, and the small pale wood chairs that Micah had cleaned the morning before stood in 12 neat lines across the stone floor, 6 each side of the center aisle. The brass on the chapel doors caught the light from the high east window. The pine coffin on its low trestle at the front of the room had been set in place at 6 by Nathaniel alone, while the family was still upstairs. The lid was closed. The 4 polished handles caught the same morning light as the door brass. A single white rose lay on top, no others. Raya had said 1. He had given her 1. The mourners began to come in at 9:20. He counted them at the door without seeming to. 11. 12, when the old woman from the river quarter came up the steps on her son's arm. A neighbor from the apartment block. 2 men from the workshop where Vecca had spent 26 years of his life. The priest from the small Orc parish across the bridge, who had walked in his own time and arrived without ceremony in a plain black robe and a stole the color of river stone. A young woman who had once been at school with Raya, who came in alone and sat at the back and pressed her gloved fist briefly to her mouth when she saw the closed box. A man Nathaniel did not know, who stood inside the door a long moment, then took a seat at the very edge of the last row and did not remove his coat. About a dozen, he had said to Raya the day before, when she had asked if a dozen would be too few. He had said a dozen was the right number for a man who had lived his life properly and had not done it for show. He had said it level, without embellishment. She had not asked him again. Raya came down the back stairs at 9:25. Black velvet, jet beads at her throat, the lace handkerchief in her sleeve. Her hair had been brushed straight down her back, the front strands tucked behind her ears the way she had worn them on the first morning. Ursa was at her elbow, in the same black knit dress, the gray wool shawl folded over her arm now rather than worn. She had said the chapel would be warm enough. Micah followed, in his father's too big dress shirt and the black tie. The watch on his wrist was tightened to the new knot she had set himself the day before. He kept his eyes on the floor at the back of his sister's heels and did not look up at the door of the chapel as he passed it. Nathaniel held the chapel door for the 3 of them. He did not speak to them as they went through. He had said what needed saying upstairs, in 2 short sentences at the foot of the stairs at 1:15, that the priest would speak first, that he himself would read the 3 small lines at the end, that nothing else was required of any of them but to sit. Raya had nodded once. That had been enough. He let them go to the front row alone. He did not walk them down the aisle. The siblings of the dead man should not be escorted to their own father by a stranger. He had learned that early. He waited at the back instead by the chapel door, hands folded at his waist, the small white rose pinned to his lapel that Ursa had pressed into his hand half an hour before without comment. The service began. The priest spoke first, in the Orc tongue, and then in the common one. He was an old man, his voice quiet, and he did not stretch the prayers past the length they wanted to be. He spoke of Vecca by name. He spoke of the river quarter, of the workshop, of the 3 children sitting in the front row, of the wife who had gone before. He read a short passage in the older language that none in the room translated, and a few of the Orcs in the small congregation lowered their heads at the same place in the line, and Nathaniel registered that and did not ask. The priest finished, stepped back from the small lectern, and inclined his head once toward Nathaniel at the back of the room. Nathaniel walked up the aisle. He did not hurry. The polished Oxfords on the stone floor made no sound he had not already made 100 times in this room. He went to the lectern. He took the small ivory card from the inside pocket of his charcoal waistcoat. He laid it flat on the wood. He did not look at the family. He did not look at the mourners. He looked at the card. He read the 3 lines in the same level voice he had used to ask for Vecca's name on the first morning. The whistle, the breadcloth with the burn mark, the reading aloud, even to the wall. He did not embellish. He did not explain. He read them exactly as Ursa had said them on the bench under the hawthorn, exactly as he had written them down on the small card on his thigh in the cold afternoon air. 3 lines, no more. He picked the card up, folded it once, returned it to his waistcoat. He inclined his head toward the closed box at the front of the room. He returned to the back. The room was very still. Ursa, in the front row, had begun to cry again. Not the way she had cried in the doorway of the green room 2 days before, but smaller, steadier, the way a person cries when something inside them has finally been allowed to come out. Her mouth had moved upward at one corner during the second line and had stayed there. Her dimple, briefly, had come back. She held her sister's hand on her left and her brother's hand on her right, both of them, for the first time that morning. Raya did not cry through the priest. She did not cry through Nathaniel's 3 lines. She cried, finally, in the silence afterwards. A single thin movement of her shoulders, once, and the lace handkerchief came out of her sleeve and was pressed to her face for the count of perhaps 4 seconds, and went back into her sleeve. No one in the row behind her saw it. Ursa, beside her, felt it through the small shift of her sister's hand, and did not let go. Mika did not move. He stared straight ahead at the closed pine of his father's coffin, at the white rose on top of it, at the 4 brass handles his sister had helped polish in the back workroom the evening before. His jaw was set, his hand in his sister's hand, the watch on his other wrist ticking in the silence. He did not blink for a long moment. When he did, it was once, slow, and a single line of water ran down the side of his nose and into the corner of his mouth, and he did not lift his free hand to wipe it. He let it go where it was going. Nathaniel watched none of this directly. He stood at the back of the room with his hands folded at his waist and his eyes on the small carved wooden cross above the chapel door, the one his uncle had hung there 41 years before. The priest gave the closing prayer. The mourners stood when the priest stood. The 2 men from the workshop came forward and lifted one end of the coffin, and a cousin from the river quarter and the man from the back row in the unremoved coat lifted the other, and they carried Vecca down the aisle slowly, between the small pale wood chairs, past the front row where the 3 children stood with their hands joined. Nathaniel opened the chapel doors for the box to pass through. He inclined his head once as it went by, the same 2-inch movement he had been giving the family since the door at 8 on the first morning. He did not follow them out to the hearse. That was not his place at this moment. The family followed the coffin out into the autumn light, and the small congregation followed the family, and the chapel emptied row by row until only Nathaniel was left, standing at the open door, with the small white rose still pinned to his lapel, and the morning sun laying a long, pale rectangle across the stone floor where the coffin had been. He stood there a moment longer. He listened to the hearse start in the side yard, to the slow procession of footsteps on the gravel, to the bell at the eastern hill ringing the half-hour. Then he turned, quietly, and went out by the side door to follow the procession on foot at a distance, the way a keeper of a room follows a thing he has been keeping when it finally leaves him. They came back at 3. Nathaniel had been expecting them since 2. He had been in the parlor since the burial, had come back from the eastern hill alone, on foot, the long way through the river path because the walking was something his back wanted after standing through the service. He had taken off his overcoat and hung it on its hook. He had washed his hands at the small basin in the back corridor. He had set the kettle on the iron stove and let it go cold again. He had not had lunch. He had laid out on the low table in the parlor the small parcel he had prepared at 6 in the morning before any of them had been awake. The parcel was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a length of black ribbon. Inside it, the death certificate, properly stamped and folded. The small bound book of the receipts, every line in his exact hand. 3 photographs of the headstone he had taken himself the previous afternoon with his uncle's old box camera, before the burial, while the stone was still clean and the carving was fresh. A small map of the cemetery, drawn out by hand, the 3rd row from the Hawthorne line marked with a careful cross. And at the bottom of the parcel, against the brown paper, a sealed envelope. Cream paper, no name on it. The wax seal was plain, his own ring, the small silver one on his right pinky, the one that had been his mother's. The bell at the front door rang at 3 exactly. He let them in himself. Raya in the same black velvet. Ursa in the same knit dress, the gray wool shawl proper around her shoulders now. Mika in his father's shirt, the tie loosened at last by perhaps half an inch, but loosened. The 3 of them had walked the long way back, too. He could see it in their boots. None of them spoke at the door. He inclined his head 2 inches and let them through to the parlor. The last of the paperwork did not take long. He had prepared it cleanly. Raya read each page, signed at the bottom in her small, sharp hand, slid each one back across the table. Yrsa sat at her left on the settee, the shawl drawn up around her shoulders. Mika stood behind his sister's chair the way he had stood the first morning, but closer now, his hand on the back of the wood. The fire in the small parlor grate had burned itself down to embers. Nathaniel did not feed it. The room would not be in use again that day. When the last sheet was signed, Nathaniel set his pen down parallel to the page. He closed the leather book. He pushed the small brown parcel across the table toward Raya, tied with its black ribbon, as if it were simply the last item on a list. He said, level, that the papers were inside, the death certificate, the photographs of the headstone, the map. He said there was also an envelope at the bottom. He said she should open it after she had left the building. He said it once, did not repeat it, and did not soften it. Raya looked at the parcel for a moment. Then she nodded, the small 2-inch nod she had learned from him without either of them noticing. She picked the parcel up. She held it close against her chest, against the lace collar of her velvet dress, with one arm wrapped around it. The 3 of them stood. Nathaniel stood with them. There were no further words. Raya inclined her head once at him in the doorway, mirroring him perfectly, without thinking about it. Ursa stopped at the threshold and lifted her face and gave him the smallest possible smile. The dimple briefly there, briefly gone, the eyes still wet. Mika, last, paused on the front step. He turned. He looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. He did not nod. He took off his father's wristwatch in one quick movement, looked at it once, slid it back onto his wrist with the buckle on the next notch tighter, the notch he had set himself at the chair cleaning the morning before, and let his arm drop. It was not a gift to Nathaniel. It was a thing about himself, said in front of Nathaniel, on purpose, because the human was the one person standing on the step who would understand it. Then the 3 of them went down the steps to the small black car at the curb. Nathaniel watched them from the doorway, Raya in the driver's seat, Ursa beside her, Mika in the back. The doors closed, 3 soft clicks in a row. The engine did not start. He had thought it might not. He inclined his head one final time at the windshield, although he could not be sure they saw it, and closed the door of the parlor quietly. Inside the small black car at the curb, Raya did not turn the key. She set the brown parcel on her lap. She untied the black ribbon. She lifted out the papers one at a time, the certificate, the receipts, the 3 photographs of the headstone in the autumn afternoon light. She passed each one back to Ursa without looking. Ursa took them carefully. At the bottom of the parcel was the cream envelope sealed with the small, plain wax. Raya turned it over once. She broke the seal with her thumbnail. Inside, 2 things. A folded sheaf of banknotes, most of what she had paid him on the first morning, counted out exactly, not a round number but the precise figure of the markup he had not taken, banded with a plain paper strip. And a small ivory card folded once. She opened it. The handwriting was the same exact hand that had written her father's name on a card on the first morning. 5 short lines. For your siblings. The rest of the figure was markup. I told you I did not need the markup today. Take it to the bank in the morning. Nathaniel Crane. Raya read the card once. Then she read it again. Her thumb went briefly to the silver locket at her throat and pressed it shut without looking, the way she had done in the parlor on the first morning. She did not start the engine. She sat with the card in one hand and the bank notes in the other and looked through the windshield at the front of the small, dark brick building, the brass plate beside the door, the tall windows with the heavy drapes, the single hawthorn branch from the back garden that hung over the wall and out into the street, half bare now, its red berries the color of the dying afternoon. Behind her in the back seat, Mika leaned slowly forward until his forehead was resting on the top of her seat, between her and Ursa, and stayed there. Ursa, beside her, set the 3 photographs down carefully on her lap, took the card out of her sister's hand, read it once herself, and folded it again along the same crease, and gave it back. None of the 3 of them spoke. Inside, in the parlor, Nathaniel did not look out of the window. He turned away from the door. The room was empty now, in the way rooms are empty after a thing is properly ended in them. The small pale wood chairs from the chapel had been brought back through and stacked along the back wall in pairs. The fire in the grate had gone to ash. The kettle on the iron stove was cold. The leather book was closed on the desk. The autumn light through the tall windows had begun to thin out, slowly, the way it does on a clear day in mid-autumn at 4 in the afternoon. He began, quietly, to put the chairs away. He took them one at a time. He carried each to the back corridor and slotted it onto its pair against the wall of the cupboard, the way he had taken them down at 5 that morning. He did not hurry. His back complained at the 3rd one, and he ignored it. He did the count in his head as he went. 11, 10, 9. And at 6, he had to stop briefly, sit the chair down on the floor of the parlor, press both hands flat to the back of it, and breathe out through his nose once. The small white rose was still pinned to his lapel from the service. He had forgotten it. He left it. He carried on. 5, 4, 3. If you have sat with this story all the way through, if Nathaniel's hands at the polish, or Mika's nod on the step, or the cream envelope in the small black car at the curb have stayed with you in any quiet way, leave a like and stay subscribed. There are more rooms like this one. There are more people who handle other people's worst days and have no place to put their own. I would like to keep telling you about them. if you would like to keep listening. 2. 1. He carried the last chair down the corridor. He slid it onto its pair against the wall. He closed the cupboard door, quietly, and the latch caught with the small click it always made. He came back into the parlor. The room was empty now. The light through the tall windows had gone the color of weak tea, the way it had been the evening Raya had come down to the workroom and helped him polish the brass. He crossed to the front window. He stood there a moment with his hands in the pockets of his charcoal waistcoat. Out at the curb, the small black car was no longer there. He had not heard it leave. They had gone at some point in the last 5 minutes, while he had been doing the chairs. He had not seen them go. That was, he thought, perhaps the way it was meant to be done. He stood at the window a moment longer. The hawthorn branch from the back garden moved once in the late air. A single brown leaf came loose from it and went slowly down past the glass and out of sight. He watched it go. He did not follow it with his eyes after it had passed the lower edge of the window. He breathed out once through his nose. The small white rose at his lapel had begun to lose a single petal at the outer edge. He noticed it. He did not remove it. He turned away from the window. He crossed the parlor to the lamp on the desk. He turned the wick down by half. The room dimmed. The autumn light from outside took over what was left. He picked up the last small ivory card from the desk, the first one with Vecca's name on it in his own hand, and slid it carefully into the inside pocket of his waistcoat against the pocket watch. He stood a moment in the middle of the empty room. Then, quietly, he went to put the kettle on.